Ethical decision-making has 8 basic steps. The most important thing to start with is identifying the dilemma. Oftentimes, we're faced with all sorts of decisions, and we may not naturally see the dilemma embedded in the decision process. So, part of what we do with ethics training is help people be aware of when they are in the midst of potentially um, ethical issues, or potential ethical issues. And so we might, give them case after case of different scenarios and what ethical rules would apply here, and um, you know, where is there a possibility that you might fall victim to a decision-making bias and then end up doing something unethical, et cetera, et cetera. And so our training that we do in the organization helps people be aware of the dilemmas that they're going to face. Then there's the data gathering phase. And as we've already talked about when we discussed decision-making biases, some of our challenges in being able to make good decisions and gather data is that we are gathering data in a biased way. We are looking for confirming evidence. We only do limited searches. We have a self-fulfilling prophecy, or self-justifications for the decisions that we're making. And so our goal really is, at this point in the process, is working hard to figure out how to find the unbiased facts. So we need to do a broad search. We need to not remove certain outlets as a waste of time, because we want to know what is confirming evidence, and we need to also actively look for disconfirming evidence, so looking at the two to combine. And so you can see how in the beginning we need to identify where the dilemma is, and even know when we're in that situation where there's a dilemma, and then learn how to gather data in a way that makes sure that we're not just limiting what we're collecting as a way of it being a biased data. Once we have gathered all those facts in step 3, we're looking at alternatives and what kinds of alternatives are available to us. And here's where a framing bias can come into play, right? We tell people choose A or B. And choosing A or B may not be the only option. There may be a multitude of other options that we can actually utilize to collect data. So and make choices. We might have option Y, we might have option Z, we might have option K. All of those are potential options, but we want to make sure that we don't limit our frame of reference in thinking that it's either A or B. Maybe it's a combination of A and B. Maybe there's a creative solution to the problem. The goal is to not limit yourself in those solutions. Don't use an inertia bias where we do the same thing we've always done. We don't want to have a frame and an anchor to only certain ideas, or framing ideas only in a limited way. We want to allow and open up our minds and the minds of others to think about all those options. Then we have to consider stakeholders, as well as what the impact those alternatives have on the stakeholders. And so 4 and 5 kind of happen simultaneously. Number 4 is who is going to be affected by these decisions, or who will affect us as we are ready to make this decision. So who's involved in the process, who has power, who is most motivated to have their interests be met. Recognize this is where politics come into play. Stakeholders will engage in politicking to serve their own needs. They may not necessarily be engaged in what's the best thing for the organization as a whole. Obviously, each organization has its own self-interest, right? I mean, environmental companies, their self-interest is to benefit the environment. And so on the one hand, they're politicking to meet their own needs, but on the other hand, that politicking and those needs are really about what the community at large, they believe the community at large needs. And so what we want to be thinking about and identifying the stakeholders is really having a very broad view of the stakeholders, which ones have the most power, which ones have the most influence, which one do we have to pay attention to the most. Sometimes people will say, well, it's the shareholders. The shareholders should have the most attention. Sometimes that's true, and sometimes it's not. shareholders will benefit from the organization if the organization makes sure that all of its stakeholders are being treated fairly. And in the end, as we'll see with in different exercises, when we treat our stakeholders fairly, our shareholders will benefit in the long run. So once we identify those stakeholders, we have to figure out what impact it's going to have on them. So if we choose to do something, each one of the stakeholders is going to be affected very differently and for different reasons. And some of them may think it's a positive effect and some of them may think it's a negative effect. So we have to recognize what those effects are, whether it's a right or a wrong. And again, organizations that ignore those impacts are doomed to be greatly affected by a negative relationship with those stakeholders if they continue to treat those stakeholders as if they don't matter in the process. In terms of the next step, number 6, it's the additional assistance. And we have to recognize that we are not limited to only engaging in ethical dilemmas or ethical thought or ethical reasoning on our own. We should embrace others. We should go talk to a significant other that we trust. We should talk to a boss. We should talk to an ethics representative in your company, or go to your profession and ask the people there about what they think would be the ethical thing to do based on the guidelines of your profession. So it's important that you not make an ethical decision on your own. It actually is important for you to have people that you can bounce those ideas off of, that you can trust, to help you reason through the issues and help you to see things from a different perspective. 7 and 8, step 7, basically, go and do it. Once you've made your decision through the assistance of talking with others, through considering all the impacts on all the stakeholders, through thinking about all sorts of creative alternatives, you implement your plan. But the most important step is, of course, monitoring the outcomes. If you really were concerned that you were going to be making an unethical decision, you need to be monitoring the process after you've made the decision to see what happens and to make sure that you are not in a circumstance where the decision was made and then it had a negative impact. At that point, then you've got to fix the problem. So you can't just make the decision and walk away. You've actually got to continually monitor. And even if the situation is good, there may have been things that you could do to improve that decision. So you always go back, you monitor it, you look at the outcomes and you see if it was effective, and you think about ways that you could improve your decision process as you go through. So one of the big questions, of course, is why business ethics? What can business learn from philosophy? And of course, we can always learn important things from philosophy. Philosophy is a way of thinking, a way of critically analyzing something. It's a way of looking at fallacies and making sure that we are recognizing when fallacious arguments are being made. It's really easy for us to fall victim to all of those kind of decision-making biases because fallacies, critical fallacies and decision-making biases go hand in hand. But the only way we're going to get an ethical social system in our culture, in our society, is to have boundaries around what we consider to be ethical behavior. And of course, then from there, in that subset, legal, appropriate legal behaviors. So we should always be thinking about, as we analyze any case, anything around people's actions, specifically in business, to be thinking about what are the ethical implications of what we're doing, because when we don't address those issues, it becomes a long-term problem for us. But definitely philosophical theories, even political philosophy, as you'll hear from Michael Sandel, really has an impact on what the kinds of decisions that we make when we're in business. So the better that we understand these theories and we think about how we can apply them, the better off we are with respect to being able to make good, sound decisions, in general as managers. Ultimately, we are studying the foundations of philosophy and ethical theories because we want to be able to have a good, strong background upon which to rely so that we can argue through and reason through different scenarios and try to identify really what is the most obvious, ethical, logical solution for ourselves. And of course, logical is in the eye of the beholder, but nonetheless, by understanding these ethical theories, we start to then develop tools and a toolkit to start thinking about how do we deal with dilemmas when we face them. So the big ethical question, if you recall, is how should we live our lives? You know, what is the way we should behave? And of course, it's all about ethics and ethical theories, and so depending on the ethical theory, that should is very different. We should live our lives in one way based on utilitarianism, and a very different way based on social justice theories. So what you're going to get in the next slide is a partial answer to that question, a very small part of the answer to that question. It's a small lecture from Michael Sandel, who is the author of the book that you guys have to read called Justice. And Michael is just an outstanding lecturer, so I thought it would be a great opportunity to just hear what he has to say. It echoes a lot of the stuff that you read in your book, but I think the way he delivers it is really helpful, this whole idea of the trolley car example.